Hi, my name is Andrew, also known as Drewski, and welcome to the Unsolicited podcast, where you may not have asked, but we're going to answer. Thanks for tuning in and listening, and go ahead and give us a follow if you enjoy this episode, but we're going to go ahead and dive right in. Hi, my name is Andrew Emerson, but you can call me Drewski, and welcome to the Unsolicited podcast. Today I have three special guests joining me. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Caleb.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Hannah.
And today we're going to be talking a little bit about sex in a Christian viewpoint. Caleb, do you want to share a little bit about the sermon that you talked about at RUF last Wednesday?
Yes. So I'm a pastor and I work at RUF with RUF. On Wednesday, I am preaching through the Proverbs, and I just to give a 2-minute overview of some of my main points from the two passages. I believe that I kind of started explaining that I believe that Jesus's love for the church is a directive for how sex plays itself out. And so when it says in Ephesians 5 that the two became one flesh, and this, Paul says in verse 32, is a great mystery, and it's referring to Christ's love for the church. That's not just marriage. That's not just a spiritual oneness. That's not just an emotional oneness. That's also directive for sex. And so you learn a lot about Jesus's love for the church. Some points I gave is that it was sacrificial. It was intending the good of the other. It was consensual. It was underlined by a covenant of commitment, and a variety of other things. It was, and that gives directive for how, and as the church, we receive Christ. He knocks on the door. We open. We love Christ. We pursue Christ. And so that's kind of the overarching 30-second version of a 10-minute point. There's a lot more that could be said to that. And then I would realize I'm speaking to a room full of single people. And so what's it mean for us? And I think this is maybe where I think some people have had some opinions on, and I think we've had some really fruitful conversations about. But there is a passage in Proverbs 6 where it talks about denying the adulterous woman or the promiscuous woman. Don't desire her. And so I talked a bit about desires and proper desires and improper desires, and really talked about how all of us, but I particularly spoke to the men, are to desire not sex, because to desire sex is really aimed at something you can get, instead of, again, emulating Christ's sacrificial, others-centered love. You desire the good of another. And so we move toward, and I encouraged, and really my last couple minutes were spent encouraging both men and women to pursue the other and pursue something good. I think there may be a lot more to say to that end, but it's kind of maybe as a good starting point. And I have in mind always, whenever I teach, I have in mind a lot of conversations, and particularly on this topic, I've read so many books and listened to a lot of people talk about this. I do know, and I particularly called out kind of this Christian message or idea that like we just need to shun our desires that are sexual. And I said, I bet if most of us were being honest, our sexual desires are something that we wish we could just kind of turn off until we get married, and then we can turn on. And that they're primarily bad until we're married. Yet we all have them. Yeah, I think that the idea that like how then are they good? And they teach us self-denial. They teach us self-control. They teach us and they form us into people of love. They help us persevere. They help build character. They're doing something good for us, and they're directing us towards something good, which is somebody else that we can give ourselves to for their good. But I was going somewhere with that. So this idea of shunning, I'm going to ramble a little bit. this idea of shunning, the like slapping your wrist or turning your face when you see someone walking down the street, just like trying to kill your desire, I actually don't think is the biblical response. The opposite of that, the world would say, the quote unquote world would say that the freedom is really found in just giving into all of your desires. And I would say actually freedom is found in getting outside of yourself and pursuing somebody else. And so I think that sparked a little bit of conversation, and I think that was a new thought that people have been wrestling with.
Well, I've been reading the book Unwanted actually, and it starts out kind of that way, that when you think of your sexual desires, it feels like something evil just innately. But when you think back to creation and the garden before the fall, it's like God created the sexual desires for good. And I think that that's something that we don't see just because of how much sex has been twisted, especially in today's culture. Because we know that sin is anything that's outside God's created, what he's created and how he's designed the world to be. And so there is a designed use for sex, but we've kind of just fallen away from that. So can you talk a little bit, anybody is welcome to discuss this, but just kind of talk about how you feel like we can correctly do sex, but that's a interesting.
Yeah, correctly do. Well, I want to comment on your point earlier.
Sure.
I mean, I do think that most of us in the Christian world thinks of the gospel beginning at the fall, and that it is really good for us to go and remember, no, it actually begins with creation. And that, I've used this analogy a ton, but there's a book that talks about how every knock at the door of a brothel is actually a knock seeking after God. And it really is saying that at the baseline of all of our desires is something really good. And we really desire connection. We desire intimacy. We desire to be seen. We desire to give of ourselves to others and for others to receive us. And we take shortcuts, and we meet those desires in unsatisfactory ways. But that really speaks to the idea that everything's created good, and the gospel begins at creation. So that's any other, you'll chime into that? Yeah.
Kind of a follow-up question. Something you mentioned a lot last night, even just now, was pursuing the good and not just shunning the bad. And I think, I hear that and kind of know what you mean, but I think there may be some listeners who that comes off really vague and don't really know, like, when you say pursue marital sex, like, what does that look like to the single person sitting there in the room hearing you say that?
Yeah, I think the shun the bad, I'm specifically thinking about kind of this accountability culture which is really, it's desiring to be good, but it's primarily aimed at sin avoidance. I think Unwanted uses the word sin management. That we think if we could just manage our sin good enough, if we could just, put up enough restrictions and slap our wrist enough times. That's something that people used to do when I was in college, as you wear rubber bands, and every time you're tempted to look at a hot girl, you slap the rubber band. And we think that that's actually going to change our desires like that. And that's kind of crazy. And so I was really kind of going against this idea of this shunning, and instead, like, no, you actually desire a good thing. Your problem is not, and what I said on Wednesday night, your problem is not your inability to turn from the bad thing. Your problem is that you are actually scared, possibly. And I think there's a lot of good reason, and maybe we can get into that in a little bit, but you're scared, or you lack courage, or maybe even sometimes you lack the desire to move towards what is good, which ultimately is marital intimacy. Like, that is good. As the proverb says, like, the love of the wife and the man is intoxicating. But that begins for the single person with a lot of small first steps, which is like, all right, let's and we could get into some of those steps, but there's some beginning movement toward that end that's actually good. You ought to be taking and have some courage to take. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Do you have a follow-up question? Hannah, I don't know if you want to chime into anything there.
Yeah, I think I would add, for women pursuing the good, I think one important thing could be like embracing and realizing that our bodies are good. I think a lot of women struggle with that, and especially with, culture and things like that, there can be a lot of shame around our bodies. And around the idea of sex and remembering back to what you guys were saying, that ultimately, like, God did create our bodies for pleasure and for good. Like, he created us anatomically to be able to, like, experience pleasure. I think learning that and, like, talking about that can be really powerful and important, because we never do. And that's why a lot of women, even when they enter into marriage, have, like, hard times having sex and like embracing the good of that. But then I would kind of also follow-up question want to talk about this idea of, we're talking about pursuing good now as single people, but how do you do that in a way that's not like unwanted sexual behavior? I feel like unwanted sexual behavior is the only way people like interact with their sexuality in singlehood.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think this is, Jack, what you and I were talking about. I think before I even begin to answer that question, I started to kind of go on a rabbit trail on this Wednesday night. Like, I think that the system that we are all kind of stuck in is a new system. It's a system called dating. It's prolonging marriage. I would say that the way that we are designed sexually and just as humans to be, like, there's a reason that every other generation and every other society, definitely in the time of the Bible, did marriage and sex much earlier than we do. And so we're in this really displaced time, and you add in all sorts of different variables, and it's a time full of confusion and insecurity. But yeah, I think that there's two answers I'd give to that. One is the need for, well, maybe three answers. One is, and I know this is going to sound really Christian-y, everything begins with a deeper connection and intimate relationship with Jesus. Like, I'd be remiss to begin anywhere else. That there is, even as a married man, my primary intimate needs are not met in Maggie. And when I look to her, that's my wife, and when I look to her to do that, I'm in a world of trouble, because I'm putting her on a pedestal and in a place where she doesn't belong. But the deeper I feel in union with Jesus, the more actual intimacy I can experience with my wife. And I think that is true for everybody. So it begins with this union with Christ and this relationship with God. The second thing I'd say is we cancel out the idea that celibacy and waiting and chastity, or however you'd want to say it, is a bad thing. So we put our sexual desires on hold with patience, and that's a good thing. And like I said on Wednesday, believe it or not, 99.9% of my life, I do that as well. And there are some moments as a married man that I don't do that, but most of my life is one of chastity and celibacy. You learn to have mastery over your desires. You learn to not be driven by your desires, but to become more and more obedient to God. And there actually becomes a lot of joy in that and freedom in that. And so celibacy, placing those things intentionally in a celibate life, is a good thing. Jesus was celibate. Paul was celibate. Like, we're all being formed into the image of Jesus. He had to have had sexual desires, right? Like, he was a human. And he learned to be celibate and worship God in his obedience in that area of his life. The third thing is the connection between deep friendship. And I spoke about that a few weeks ago, but I was reading that passage with you in 2 Samuel, where David says that there was an even deeper love that he shared with Jonathan than he did with any other woman. And some people, I think, have mishandled that and turned that into a kind of this homoerotic tale. And I don't think we have really much biblical credibility to do that. But he's exposing there that there is a deepness that you can actually share with a friend that scratches a lot of that itch for intimacy. And so, yeah, that's where I would maybe go. I think that the more you walk out your relationships and your desire for intimacy with friends, I'll add fourth thing in here. And I always say this with people who are dating, if you're primarily connecting through sexual ends, like if the substance of your relationship is that 11 p.m. makeout session or going beyond that, and like it's just not gonna last long. And when you get into marriage, you're gonna be in a bit of trouble because you're gonna have to realize that was not a very steady ground we built a relationship on. And so you have to build a relationship on a spiritual connection, an emotional connection, a human connection. And there will be, the deeper that creates, there might be a deeper longing for sexual intimacy. And Paul actually addresses that. He's like, all right, well, if you have such strong urges, like time to get married, come on, people, hurry up. And I would say the same thing.
I think just to kind of add on to that point, another book that I recently read was called Single, Dating, Engaged, Married. And something that he kind of addresses in there is until you're married, you have no additional rights when you're dating or additional, like as soon as you start dating someone, it's not like, okay, now we can do this because we're married. And so when you're in a relationship and you're not married, what he kind of suggests is that you treat it as if like, okay, this is still a friendship and I still need to respect you and respect your personhood after, if we never end up getting together or end up getting married, like you need to be comfortable with how you're leaving them post that relationship. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. And my counselor even a few months ago helped see that my primary relationship, my eternal relationship with Maggie is one of a sister. She's my sister in Christ. Yeah. And like that's we will not be married in heaven. She will always be my sister who's loved. So anyway, that kind of helped me as we were working through some conflict, helped me like, okay, how does God see her? How does God treat her? He's inviting you to see her that same way and treat her that same way. Anyway, to that point, I think that's a great point.
Yeah. And I think that just, there's a lot of people today who'll be like, okay, well, like now that I'm in a relationship, like how far can I go? And something that my pastor or previous pastor at a church has said is, well, you want to set a line and then you don't want to set a line and then try to get your toes right on the line or like try to scoot over it. Like you want to set it far back enough to where you're never going to reach whatever your fearful goal is. If you're not wanting to like make out before you get married, then maybe don't kiss before you're married. And so I think that that's something that we don't really tell people today. We're just kind of, because we're kind of afraid, I feel like in Christian circles especially, to just talk about the idea of sex or just intimacy in dating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's better to err on the side of caution than to err on the side of, hey, I like want to do this and want to do this before I get married. So.
And people always ask me that question, people who are dating, and I always refuse to answer it for them because what they're really looking for me to do is to give them a bar that they can try to abide by that will help appease their conscience. They're trying to help me resolve their problem of an anxious conscience. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to give you that bar, because what if I were to say no kissing? Like, okay, well, that sucks. Let me ask someone else. Let me see what some other pastor might tell me. Who can tell me the furthest bar that I can always, that's what we do. That's how our minds work. Anyway.
So we're going to go ahead and move into some questions that were asked after the sermon that you gave on Wednesday. And anyone is free to answer these. And I may direct it in some people's direction. But so the first question we have, how do you balance knowing you are broken and in need of a savior while being confident enough to pursue a relationship? Can someone ever feel ready or prepped to enter a relationship, or do you just full send it and rely on God?
Yeah, Hannah, those seem to be two different questions. So ask the first part again first.
Okay. How do you balance knowing you are broken and in need of a savior while being confident enough to pursue a relationship?
Yeah. Do you want me to chime in first, or you? I don't know if you have a thought to that. Yeah.
You can chime in first because I have more of a thought about the second question.
Okay, cool. I really think that kind of goes to what I was talking about. With the broken story begins at the fall. Like, so the equipped version begins at creation. And also like, and we've talked a lot about that. That's like that royalty. That's the dignity that we have as a person in God's image. And then the redemptive part is that we are that we, yes, are ashes, but we are crowned with glory, and that we're being redeemed in Christ. And so, of course, there is brokenness, there's fear, there's everyone. One of the things we really take seriously in RUF is that everyone has their own individual story. Everyone grows and is sanctified at a different pace. We all come in with certain levels of baggage, and it's different. Ours is different than someone else. And so someone's brokenness, I know I quote C.S. Lewis a lot, and I've seen people laugh at me now because I quote him so much. But he has that line, something along the lines of Mere Christianity, of like, one man's courage gets him laughed out of a room, where another man's courage sends him to the front lines of battle. But you never know, maybe the man who was laughed out of the room had more courage than the other. And his point is that maybe the first man who was laughed out of a room was so beaten down in life and his upbringing that he finally said something. He spoke up in company, and he said it with such a meek voice that he got laughed at. But maybe that even attempt to speak up was such an act of courage, because he'd never been allowed that growing up. Whereas the other person maybe was, raised in some macho man house, and like going, and his grandpa and grandpa's grandpa, all these people were in active military, and so he's just doing what others have done, and maybe he didn't feel like he had any other reason to do. So on the surface, you can't really tell the difference. So it's really hard to say blank slate what it looks like for each individual person, but it really is. The scriptures and the Spirit are always mirrors and conviction and guidance and helping us navigate. Am I leading? Am I prevented to take a step out of an over diagnosis of my brokenness, or like I don't know. That first step looks different for every person. Than maybe where I would land the plane. Yeah, I don't know, Jack.
So, the first half of that question really kind of cuts deep with me, because I feel so kind of bonked over the head with the idea of being a depraved sinner who's broken and needs Jesus, and I get it, and I feel like a lot of men have been humbled and just walk with this head down shame and awareness of sin, and it just kind of completely forgets about the other half of the gospel being renewed in Christ and royalty. And man, that's the part that I feel like we don't hear enough, particularly as men. But I mean, I don't know, maybe, I don't know if women feel that too, but just, yeah, it's the sin part is so clear and the confidence part is so quiet.
I feel like you kind of have these two extremes of men nowadays, it feels like, where you have this really like beaten down, like what you would call like a friend zone kind of guy. And then you have this like, I hate to even like say the name, but then you have like this really like overconfident, like Andrew Tate-ish type guy. And those are like the two extremes that we kind of see more now. And maybe that's just because they're more pronounced and more like one of them's more loud and one's more timid. And so I think that's just kind of the struggle.
Andrew, that's the guy you told me about the other day. He's like the total jerk guy.
He's like, yeah.
Just beats people down.
Yes.
Okay. Right.
So.
The guy sounds like a winner. And by winner, I mean a total loser.
Yes.
Okay. But so those are contradictions. So the first person, explain what the first person is.
So I would
what do
say,
you mean by a friend zone?
I would say this is the guy, what we would call, at least, maybe this is just me, but what we would call this guy is like a pygmy. He's like, oh, like.
Have you heard of this term? A pig meat?
Pygmy.
Pick me?
Andrew taught me.
All right. Man, y'all are making me feel so old right now.
Basically, what this is like, oh, like, I'm just a nice guy. Like, no one will ever date me. Or.
It's like, pick me.
Yeah. And then on this other side, you have this, like, well, I just pick whoever I want and they're going to go with me kind of thing,
Okay.
And I think these are kind of you could disagree or agree.
I would kind of push back on the pick me. I think the majority of men that I see around just walking on campus are not a pick me at all. It's like a actively remove themselves from the situation, don't pursue, don't want to be picked, it's kind of like a full recession rather than like a sweetheart little like, ah, man, I'm here. It's like, no, they just completely fall away and hide and disappear on campus.
Yeah, I would. But I'm also not on ground zero. I'm not interacting with your peers every day. But I would definitely agree more with Jack there of seeing there is just a total despair and a giving up. But my brain, remind me where we got on this trail. What was how did we land talking about this paradox of men of one side or the other? What were we talking about? You remember? Okay, I don't necessarily remember either. But you were about to comment on the second
we'll go
part
back,
of that question.
We'll go back to the second question. So, can someone ever feel ready or prepped to enter a relationship, or do you just full send it and rely on God?
Yeah, so I want to answer that, and I also want to kind of talk about what we were just talking about, because we're talking about these guys. I have a lot of compassion and empathy for them, but they're also not like victims. Like they have an ability to. I think we just need to hold both. That they're not complete victims, and can more fully rest in the gospel of their own accord. But so I was going to say to this question, I think it is so important to be both aware of your sin and aware that you can like hurt someone and that you will hurt the person you're in a relationship with, just like you would in any other relationship. And then also be confident in your identity in Christ as you're moving into a relationship. I think that allows you to be able to move toward the person if you've hurt them, if they've hurt you, and if there's something going wrong in the relationship. And I think that is such a key part of relationships, is being able to talk. So to answer the question more directly, I don't think you can ever be fully prepped to enter a relationship. I don't think, like me and Brennan, I don't think we were very prepared at all, but we were able to figure it out together because we were able to talk to each other when things were wrong, and we were able to grow in that together and kind of prepare in a sense each other as we went along in our relationship.
And to ask a follow-up question, so this is just from personal experience or prior experience, and this could be a men and women thing, but sometimes you hear the excuse of, I'm not spiritually where I need to be, or I'm not, as an excuse to not enter in a relationship. Do you feel like that's a valid excuse, or what are your thoughts on that?
Is that coming from men or women?
For me, it's from woman.
Like a woman saying that about a man?
No, a woman saying, I do not feel spiritually ready to enter a relationship with you. Like, I'm not where I need to be.
It's a good question. I hear that people talk about that all the time.
I do too.
Yeah.
My gut reaction is that it's not super valid. That I think people use it as an excuse. And I think God is always with us. The Holy Spirit's always working. And so if they genuinely want to be in a relationship, and then they will. And I think God uses that desire and can work through that. Like he can make you, he can continually work through you.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to talk about this maybe in a fuller way, because later, can you write it down as like something we can chat about? Because I think it is a really big deal, this idea of like, what does spiritual leadership and prep like how are we spiritually prepared in a relationship? I actually see some correlation between the two questions now that we've talked enough about it. That there's something about being prepared or ready for marriage. Was that the second part of the question? Is really shown by the other person's receptivity to your brokenness. Where if you can have the courage to move towards someone as your real self, who is both royal and being redeemed and also stricken by sin and, corrupted in a lot of ways. If that person can receive that real self, and like, you don't feel like you get to a point where you no longer feel like you have to put on this pretend face and be perfect for them. And you're able to talk through some of that. Like, okay, you guys are in a pretty good spot. Like it seems like you're on the up and up here. So I do see a lot. I do see a lot of correlation between the two. But yeah, I think that I'd love to talk about the spiritual thing here in a little bit.
Okay, we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next question. Are people too picky when looking for a spouse? Where's the balance between looking for your perfect soulmate and just settling for the next Christian with the opposite chromosome?
Oh yeah, we talked about this one.
I thought this one was a funny question.
Yeah. Yeah, I answered it. Do you have an answer, Hannah?
I
or
was
Jack?
actually going to ask Hannah what her thoughts on it, because I think that typically what you hear from, I feel like what you hear from men is that women's standards are too high. Mm-hmm. And then from what you hear from women is that, well, there just aren't enough good men, or the standards are like, their standards are, men's standards are too low almost, and like they're willing to accept any woman, if that kind of makes sense. Maybe I'm just yapping, but.
No, I've heard that too. I think people, and a lot of women, are too picky when looking for a spouse. I think they definitely can be. It reminds me of last winter conference, the speaker, Brent Corbin. He had a little intercession and just kind of said, so many of you complain because you're not dating and you're not getting married, but like some of you just need to find a Christian guy that you like and get married and figure it out together. And that is kind of rash, and a lot of people probably won't like that. But I think that on the flip side, we can be very, very picky and find every little detail for why this person isn't the right person. And I think at the end of the day, I kind of just want to ask a lot of those women, like, do you like the guy? So I think if you like the guy, then it'll be fine. And if he's a Christian, but if you're like finding all of these things, at the end of the day, I'm wondering, maybe you just don't really like the person. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So if I can, as kind of a follow up to that, so if you were a Christian girl, single at least, and then a guy that you knew and you were friends with, and like you had some things that you were like, like I'm not like red flags, I guess is what you would call him. Like he doesn't have any red flags, but he's just like a good Christian guy, but you're not really like super sure. Do you think that in general, you should always like kind of give at least one, like if he asks you out, you should give him at least a date to kind of feel it out and like see if it's compatible? Because I feel like sometimes you can just get rejected without really even getting an opportunity as a Christian man.
Yeah, I definitely don't see the harm in saying yes. I think it's a good idea to give it a try to see how you drive. Yeah.
Hannah, what did you think of Caleb's his advice last night, where he said to men, if you think she's semi-attractive, if she loves Jesus, and if she has good friends, that you should marry her? How did that land?
Well, you should maybe date her. like yeah. Those would be the 3 green flags. Like, are you attracted, or at least like semi-attracted? Yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah.
She's not ugly. I'm sorry. Just kidding.
Yeah. I like it. I think that you could say the same for women, like the reverse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would add, yeah, you said if she's a Christian, if you're like very on the same page faith-wise. Some people can be very different. Christian can mean different from different.
You mean like denominationally, or in your walk with Christ, or what exactly?
Actually, I was talking about this with a friend yesterday, and there's a difference between like saying you're a Christian and then like actually pursuing Jesus and growing in your spirituality, if that makes sense. So there's like the Christian who like posts on their Instagram and maybe they're like reading the Bible occasionally, and then there's those who are like actively growing with those around them, and then investing time in prayer and scripture reading and serving others. Does that kind of make sense? So I think, is that kind of that a little bit?
But at the same time, I don't think you need to judge your significant other based on how much time they're spending like in the Word and in prayer.
Yeah, I think that like that goes back to the question that we were just talking about, like the spiritual readiness. I do think that
maybe we should just.
And I think a lot of that is more driven by fear than anything else. I mean, I just think about my relationship with Mecky when we were dating. Like, I was a brand new Christian; she'd been Christian her whole life, and we kind of tell our story like we were. I was the younger prodigal son running into the house, and she was the older son running into the house, and we met in the home at the same time. And we would have, on the surface, looked like we were on totally different pages, which we were. And she was much more spiritually knowledgeable than I was, but she was kind of burning out. I knew very little about the Christian faith, but I was really on fire. And so it's really, really hard to tell where someone's at. And I think oftentimes we want to try to get this diagnosis out there sometimes driven out of wisdom, but mostly driven out of fear. And then there's some legitimate things to like be concerned about. I mean, to your point, Andrew, I do think that there's, on the surface, there are people who can tend to be going through the motions, and some people who are more committed. But even that, I mean, sometimes I go through the motions, and going through the motions is good. Like sometimes I feel on fire and sometimes I don't. And I would more implore the person who is wanting to be critical of their boyfriend or girlfriend and their stage of spirituality, and let their lack of spirituality actually be a reflection to your judgmentalism, and say maybe your judgment and self-righteousness that you feel towards your boyfriend or girlfriend actually is exposing your lack of spirituality. That what would it look like to extend this person grace, or to say an honest thing to this person, or maybe to move toward and show love towards someone who might be the tax collector beating their chest at the bottom of the stairs. And but most people don't like to hear that, so I'll say it on this instead. But I do have a thought about what you were talking about earlier, and this goes back to that podcast that I showed you a while back about just the unusual state of dating, where because of a lot of different factors, like and this is kind of spirituality stuff aside, like generally this guy's point was saying that women want to date someone who is horizontal, kind of on the same, if you think about career pathwise, and just kind of material worldly success wise, so same level as them, or higher. And guys want to date someone who's on the same level as them or lower. No guy is eager to go chase after the girl who's going to make him feel like he's a piece of crap. And no girl is going to go chase after a guy who, though the movies might depict the guy like, is this kind of like the boss chick in the dumb Zach Galifianakis character? Yeah. Like that's in a lot of Hollywood movies. That actually is a recipe for disaster. It doesn't really work out. No one actually wants that. No boss chick really wants a Zach Galifianakis who sits at home, smokes pot all day. Yet there seems to be some structures in society right now, and just the way that things are kind of playing itself out, where you have to the point of what we were talking about earlier, where you have a lot of guys who are feeling a little bit plowed down, though they're not victims. You're right, Hannah. Are feeling a lack of movement out, and so they're kind of portraying themselves. They see, or maybe internally they see themselves as this Zach Galifianakis pot smoking idiot. And no girl wants to date that person, and so they're doing themselves a disservice. And so generally, we're otherwise. I mean, I've said this before. I mean, if you look at, I think this is generally true to you. Like, I would imagine that the president of most clubs and the top leaders in classrooms and whatnot are majority women, and I think that's what I see is the people on this campus who are mostly involved are the highest achievers on this campus, generally speaking, are females.
Yeah.
The people who are most uninvolved, sitting in their rooms in the weekends, playing video games and sitting in their underwear, are mostly men. And you want to ask why no one's dating. And it's like, well, there you go. Those girls don't want to date those guys, and those guys are extremely intimidated to date those girls. And I don't know what to do about that, but it's not like reverse roles and, let's get the girls in their undies and making them play video games and the guys are their leaders. I think that would be totally the false solution, but it's an interesting thought.
This next question says, how do you go from experiencing years of being taught by culture to pursue sex alone to desiring a spouse?
Okay. Yeah. So that's one of the points I was making in the sermon, was desiring sex. If your main intent is to desire sex, like you're really going after something for your own good, which is not emulating nor being an icon for Jesus's oneness with us. He is not desiring something from us. He's fully giving himself to us for our good. And so we're desiring to do that to somebody else. I mean, so now with the context, restate the question, like, how do I go from, I've learned that I need to desire sex.
So how do you go from being taught by culture, I'm assuming upbringing, and to pursue sex by itself, to desiring a spouse? Yeah.
Oh, how do you do that? I don't know. I mean, I think that would go back to what I was talking about earlier with like a relationship with God, like the truth, like the ministry of the word, experienced and developed through the community of other believers. Yeah, I mean, like calling out lies where you see them, like, no, desiring sex, that is selfish. Like, it's selfish. Like, speak back in your head, speak back to quote unquote culture. Like, that's purely you're going after your own gain. And even within, like I said the other night, like even within the context of marriage, if I'm just desiring sex, what I'm really saying is I desire to use my wife so that I can feel better right now. Like, that's not Jesus in the church. And if you do enough of that in your marriage, you're going to actually grow apart, and you're going to get divorced, and you're going to be unhappy. Your wife's going to feel that she probably won't orgasm, like, and that's the majority of men. The reality is, like, the majority of beneficiaries on desiring sex is men, because they're going to orgasm almost every time very easily. Women struggle to orgasm, and I think part of the reason there is, well, I don't want to get into that, but like, if my aim is to have my wife orgasm, that's a very different aim than desiring and aiming for mine. And I think that Christians teach in the context of marriage, sex, the aim of your sex is to make your partner orgasm. And it's a really beautiful thing when that happens. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, as you were talking about that, you were saying desiring sex is selfish.
Okay. Someone asked a question about that, by the way. Yeah.
How do you walk the line between having that as the truth and then also having, but sex is good and like a good gift from God?
Yeah.
And our bodies are good and arousal is good and all these things.
Yeah. Sex is good when your partner is receiving you and pursuing your end, like your end. Sex is not good when it's this, when I'm chasing after my own desire and my own end. It might momentarily feel pleasurable. That doesn't make it good. It does feel pleasurable, absolutely. And again, majority of the people that feel pleasure by that are men. So desiring sex is, so like, I would imagine, like, you can respond to this, like a female desiring sex has a different end in mind than a man desiring sex. A woman who's desiring sex, what they really want, and studies have shown this. I mean, there's a book, that The Sex and the Soul. They study all these different colleges, and they interview all these different girls who are kind of living this intentionally promiscuous life, almost hoping and thinking it's going to give them a level of authority and power in their life. And what they realize after all the sex, what they really want is a relationship. And it's like, that's what you've been designed for. Of course, that's what you want. And so what they usually mean by desiring sex is they desire to be pursued. They desire to be, received, sought after, found beautiful, all these things. What men usually want is like this, almost the same things. Like, I want to be received. I want you to think I'm awesome. I want you to think I'm doing good. I want you to, like, there's all these different desires that we have. But it works the best when you're thinking about the other. Like that, and I hope that, and I know, like, for the single college student, like, that seems so down the line, but I actually hope that it frees you a little bit of, like, you're really bombarded with a lot of lies, and those lies don't end when you become married. Anyway.
Can I ask really quick, how do you think you can, like, as a single person, how can you desire a spouse without lust and, like, without desiring them sexually? And I don't know, that word desire is interesting.
And the reason I was using desire was because of the passage in Proverbs 6 where it said, don't desire the adulterous woman, which I kind of explained, which means that there is a proper desire, which would be a spouse. So if you're not to desire an adulterous woman, you're desire your spouse. Part of my answer to this is, like, we do live in an extremely complex time where it's, the whole dating idea is really silly and new. And so how do you desire a spouse without it being lustful? Well, again, the goal here is not sin management. It's not to just try to walk on eggshells and do things by avoiding a bunch of stuff. Like, I don't know, I'm going to sound like such a Christian, but I am. So it's good. What would help would be like pursuing the Lord, being, walking out your relationship with community, talking, having good friends that ask you good questions, repentance, faith, try agains. You're going to the tricky thing, because dating is so stupid, is, and I dated too, like we all date, but it is stupid. But the tricky thing is that what really makes what makes a relationship go from like we're friends to I think we ought to date, or we are dating, or is really like these sexual desires that are hard to put a finger on and exactly explain. But it's like, yeah, we were friends, but now we're dating. Oh, well, what changed? Oh, well, now we kiss. Okay, well, that makes sense. And so, dating itself, there's a lot of I don't know. This is maybe opening a can of worms, but I remember talking to Nathan about this, where it's like dating itself is baked into dating is a lot of sin, but it's acceptable. It's acceptable in our society to lust after someone who's not your wife yet. So it's really weird. And I don't know what the alternative is. Just get paired. I mean, historically, it's just to get paired off by your parents. Arranged marriages. Like, I don't know. I think, but this is there's this like doctrine of the accommodation of God, and I think that he accommodates. Like, he's not just like, oh, you dummies. Like he's gracious towards us. He's abounding in steadfast love. Like, he's not growing tired of us. I don't know. I'm rambling.
Yeah. So this next one says, you say to both men and women to desire and pursue a spouse. How does a woman pursue when a man is called to do that in the Bible? And I kind of wanted to just give my thoughts on this a little bit, because I think that, and you Caleb, you've kind of talked about this before, but the idea that like the man is like, what remind me of like the words.
Yeah.
You like remember and.
The Hebrew words.
Yes.
Yeah. In Hebrew, the word male means the one who remembers, and the word female in Hebrew means the one who receives or bears with, surrounds.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So, what my thought on this is when you are a woman, which you can give your thoughts on this as well, Hannah, but as a man, when I'm in pursuit of a woman, what we really want is to see reciprocation, and this like kind of is what I'm doing working, basically. Like you want to see that, like
receptivity.
Yeah. And I think that's, to me, that's the best way that I know that a woman can per se pursue, because I think that's like the way that I feel most comfortable in a relationship is whenever I am taking the steps and when I'm doing the pursuit, but when she's receiving and reciprocating my pursuit. Does that kind of make sense, or anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to speak first or me?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say that definitely makes sense, and I think it's important to reciprocate and to receive well. I also think that a lot of times we can kind of get tripped up in this idea of the men pursuing, and like especially as you get further on into a relationship, I think it's a lot of pressure, way too much pressure put on the man to have to initiate every single date, to have to initiate literally everything, when it's a two-sided relationship. Yeah. And it's okay for the woman, if they're wanting to go on a date, to say like, hey, let's go on a date. Yeah.
This is kind of a question that we had for later, but I feel like it kind of relates. Is it okay for a woman to ask out the guy, how should we wait while being pursued?
I think Hannah said it very well.
Okay.
I think it's just a lot of pressure. And
yeah.
I don't know, is kind of, as weird as our culture is, it seems like it should be more acceptable for women to pursue men, but somehow that's one of the things that has managed to stay pretty old-fashioned, I guess. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that I would agree with this idea of kind of a balanced pursuit at times. As far as like the woman like asking out the guy, I think that is totally acceptable. Like, you know, if you're a woman and there's this guy that's been like sitting there waiting, and maybe he just like hasn't taken the step, and we kind of talked about this like timidness that we tend to have as guys today. If you know that you feel like there's something going on and you want to take that step, I think it's okay to because sometimes it's hard for us to just tell, as guys, to tell what women are thinking. And did you?
No, so I think men and women both would gain so much from just being so much more candid. I think that is probably the biggest struggle for men in pursuing women, where if she says no, is it a no of not right now? Is it a I'm not interested? Is it you're trying to be nice? I mean, I honestly believe that women should be so harsh when rejecting men. Yeah. In certain senses, because if you're not interested, make that perfectly clear.
Not necessarily harsh, but like very clear. And sometimes that is harshness.
I think it's more loving to say, I'm not interested in you that way at all, than it is to say, oh, I don't know, maybe next time.
But to my point that I was trying to get at, I think that if you're interested in the guy and he can either be interested in you or not, but you can tell him if you know he's single and like know he like checks these boxes. Like, I think that's completely okay for you to admit your feelings to someone and be like, hey, like I've been hanging out with you a lot. Like, I'm interested in you. How are you feeling about this? And then either you can take the first step of asking out on the first date, which I think is totally okay, as long as I think the man kind of takes back over this role of pursuit after that, and becomes more of the leader in the relationship. Because, I mean, I could be wrong, but that's kind of what men are called to do is lead in the relationship, right?
Well, that opens up back to the spirituality thing. That opens up a can of worms too. I think my hesitancy when I was really fumbling around with my words when I was trying to answer this the other night is because I really try to be cautious around what's my opinion, because so much of dating, majority of dating opinion, much of dating advice is just opinion, because there's not clear direction in the scriptures. And I truly really try to be cautious of where I feel like this is coming from scripture, or where this is, maybe I'm been shaped more by culture. Because Christianity has its own subculture, which has historically taught some pretty crazy things that are not very biblical. So yeah, I mean, I do think that the idea of the man, someone came up to me afterwards and said, there used to be, I guess, like women could give off little signs, like little, and they would, I forget what they said, like they put a flower out, like, hey, if you come and find me, like, I'm going to say yes. And I think that's really super helpful. I think that men ought to pursue, yes. I think that it's a wonderful thing to do that, yes. But I also think that we're mostly pursuing based on the cues that we're picking up on. And so, like, even you see in Adam and Eve in Genesis 2, which I read the other night, like, bone of my bones. He's not just saying that blanket statement. He has now seen her, and he's responding to some cue he's gotten from her. And so we're just more intuitive than we realize we are. And it's a really, this might go into like phone stuff, which I don't want to get into fully, but like, I think we've learned, we don't know how to pick up on bodily cues anymore, because we're so online. We're so social online. And so we really struggle with these bodily cues. Now the cues are like, did that girl or guy like my post? Oh, maybe she wants to date me. Or did they slip a DM, or whatever you guys say? Like, did she snap me? And what time? Did she use enough exclamation marks? Like, all the cues that used to be bodily and should be bodily are now on our phones. And it's like, we're like, holy crap. I don't know what's going on. Does she like me or not?
And that's why I suggest, and I mean, kind of talked about it, but just being like more clear and concise about how you're feeling can eliminate kind of a need for the like pick up on cues online.
And aware. The guys need to be more aware.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would say most of the time that we're idiots, and we can, or at least for me, we're not smart and can't pick up on those things. Hannah, what were you going to?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. One, I was going to say, I've had many experiences before I met Brennan where I liked a guy and thought there was interest from him, and there wasn't.
Okay.
And it's a weird position for the girl. So I feel like we're not talking about that scenario of like, I think sometimes guys can also lead girls on unintentionally. there's also that as a place. And so that puts a lot of vulnerability in the girl to be like, hey, do you like me? And then they don't, and then it's just kind of weird. And so I think that's a hard place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something that I think that I've experienced is this is gonna go online here, but I got a DM from someone that I had known for a while, and they were just like, hey, like, it was kind of an unclear message of like, it seemed like there was interest there, but I wasn't totally sure. And so what my initial thought was is like, all right, I'm just gonna leave this and like not respond to it, because like it doesn't seem healthy for me to do that. And then I thought, okay, what's the opposite of what Andrew would do? And that would be to just reach out and like ask, like, okay, like what were you meaning by what you said? So I ended up having a phone call with this person and like cleared up like a lot of the confusion. And like that's something that I think that maybe, I mean, I don't know if it applies to both genders, but I think that that's just something that like you save yourself a lot of time and hurt whenever you can state like, okay, like here's, and it's hard to be vulnerable. Like everybody knows that, obviously, but it's like, it's a lot better to put yourself out there at the beginning when you're unsure than to like keep going along with the same thing. And then you just develop your feelings more, and then you end up getting hurt even more in the long run. Does that kind of make sense? Or, I mean, I could be wrong in that idea, yeah. But, and I think that could apply for like both women and men equally. Like,
so you're kind of saying to Hannah's scenario, it's like the earlier you could have asked, hey, I'm picking up on some stuff here. Yeah. Tell me where this is headed.
Yeah.
Are you the better?
Yeah, because I think that the longer you wait, I think that we can tend to be like these daydreamers, or like have this curious mindset, and our minds just wander. And so you're like, oh yeah, like this person is for sure interested in me or whatever. And then like the longer you wait on that, and like if you just keep going along with it, they could have totally different intentions. But if you don't clarify that, then I feel like you're setting yourself up for failure in the long run. So I think that in general, it's hard to clarify, but clarifying is better than continuing.
So I think what I'm hearing you say is men should ideally be more perceptive to signals, and either what they're receiving or what they're giving, and then be preemptively courageous with how they move towards women, and either saying like, hey, I'm interested, or hey, I'm not. I mean, because sometimes friendships, I mean, maybe we'll get into this later, male and female friendships, like how to navigate that, how to set clear boundaries, how to make interest or non-interest perfectly clear for everybody's sake.
Yeah. And I think, and like, sometimes it's just better to be, and this was in the single dating engaged married book, but it's like being overly clear about your intentions is better than being less clear. And sometimes you're like, you feel really stupid when you're like, hey, like I'm interested in you, and then they're like, I'm not. But like with everything that's going on around you, like it's fair to like sometimes have those assumptions. I think we're just scared to like admit as a people like what we're thinking, because especially in like this culture today of like the next thing I say could like get me thrown out of the room or whatever. But like it's better in my opinion, in my experience, to tell others what you're thinking and like where you're standing, so that, and generally whenever you open up, they'll open up. And I think women, they'll be like, I'm waiting on this guy to like tell me something, or like ask me out. And it's like, yes, like that's good if you want to do that. But then also like, if you tell him like, hey, like I have these feelings, and like, I just want to know like what you're thinking. So you're not sitting there and wasting a month, 2 months of your life waiting for a guy to ask you out, So that could just be not a great thought, but that's just what kind of my idea on it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good thought. I will say, I think that if you are the one to initiate as the girl, like that's fine, and you can totally do that. But just knowing that might also carry over into your relationship. Yeah. And I think being really open and transparent is good, like you said. I know on my first date with Brennan, he was dropping me off at my apartment, and we basically had like a heart to heart, and he was like, we are either going to get married or we're going to break up. And like, we had that transparent of a conversation. And I loved how direct and confident he was. And I think that there's a chance, if you are the one asking out the guy, that might not happen.
Yeah. But I also think that sometimes as a guy, like I said, like sometimes we're not like the best at picking up on these cues or like even realizing. So sometimes a girl could just be like, "Hey, I'm interested in you," and you have no idea that she was ever interested. And so I think that yes, there is the concern that like if you're the one initiating, that like that's gonna be the way it is long term, and that's not good. But you just don't really know until you try, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
But I think that's actually an interesting point, and I wonder if there is almost this. Okay, I'm going to speak in generalities, but if there's the woman who, if there's something that Disney knows about women that we don't, and that is that they're longing for this moment in this pursuit more than guys are, that they're kind of waiting to be picked up at the castle, and brought to the castle, so to speak. And that, but what I see on the other end of and to Hannah's point, because she was essentially saying, Brennan did this to me, and that's a great point. But if I would have been that forward with him, it might have scared him away. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that guys, whether that's natural or culturally conditioned, whether it kind of can come across a bit unfair. But I think that guys lead the charge in the timetable. And oftentimes guys are like, yeah, I think I like this as friends because the number one the number one reason is I just don't have time for a girlfriend right now. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, well, that's convenient for you. What if she wants, like, have you considered what she would want?
Right.
And there's this kind of mystery where the guy kind of gets to take charge of the time. And I don't know. I think that that's not right. And I also think that there's something where there's false belief that once I become, partnered up with someone, my life's just going to be totally evolved around this person, and all my time to myself is going to be gone. And it's like, no, that's not necessarily true. And also, as your relationship develops, you're probably going to want to hang out with her more, and that's a good thing. But anyway, I think is that kind of what you're saying? Is like that doesn't. If I would have said that to Brennan, maybe it would have scared him away, and that doesn't.
That it could have scared him away. More so, what I was saying is that might just be more indicative of your, like, Brennan didn't let me ask first. He was so on it.
Yeah.
I'm saying it might be more indicative of your future relationship if you have to wait so long that you are the one telling him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of situation to situation.
It is. It is. Yeah.
And we talk in generalities. So
it is.
So since we're constrained for time a little bit, we're going to move into our last question of the discussion. Should people who identify as SSA, standing for same-sex attraction, desire a spouse?
Yeah, and I think for those who aren't familiar with the word SSA, I think it's a word that a lot of people in the church use because using the word gay connotates like a particular identity to their sexual identity, and gay also maybe connotates taking action upon one's desires, whereas SSA is like, I'm attracted, but I'm resisting moving towards those attractions because I see them as disordered from the good and the male-female oneness that God has designed and which Jesus and the church is all about. So should someone who's SSA desire a heterosexual spouse and heterosexual relationship and spouse? I think so. And I think that what my answer really in saying yes breaks down is like your relationship is more than just sexual. In fact, though it's very sexual and it's great, as you develop in your relationship in marriage, like the sexual component of it really becomes less and less needed per se. That there is a longing and an intimacy that you desire and that you can have in marriage, that even if you're not like all in it with your sexual attraction to your spouse, like marriage is more than sex. Sex has a function, and its main function is creating children. So strip away all of the ideas you have about sex and marriage and all this, and there's there's more to having a spouse than just someone that you have sex with. So I know several people who are SSA and happily married. And anyway, yeah. Any thoughts or follow-ups to that?
My only follow-up would be, if you identify as SSA and are willing and fully able and desiring to commit to a life of celibacy, then I don't really see the point in desiring a spouse.
Sure, yeah. Like you have Jesus talks about the eunuchs. Some people were chose the path of becoming a eunuch, which were celibate servants, really. Some 1 Corinthians 7 talks about, I forget what passage that's in, Jesus referring to the eunuchs. I should have looked that up. 1 Corinthians 7 talks about the priority of singleness over marriage if you're pursuing life of the kingdom. I just think that our desires are more shaped out of fear than we want to think. But that's just my belief. I think even for the person who is SSA, there would be a lot of good in pursuing and desiring a spouse, unless you're utterly convinced that God is calling you to a life of celibacy for the good of the kingdom. If you're explicitly choosing the path of the eunuch versus I'm opting into the path of the eunuch or the celibate person because I'm scared to give myself to somebody else who I might not be fully sexually attracted to, and therefore our marriage would be terrible. I think that you just have to really, what are your intentions? Why are you hesitant? Why are you not wanting to desire that?
Okay, thank you guys so much for joining us on today's episode of Unsolicited. Go ahead and follow, do all the good stuff, and continue to give us a listen. Jack, Hannah, Caleb, thank you guys for joining me today.
Andrew. You're an amazing host. Good job.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
So, peace out, and hopefully you guys give a listen later. Thanks for listening to the Unsolicited podcast. I have been your host, Drewski. If you ever have a comment or question, feel free to DM me at the Unsolicited Pod on Instagram. As always, thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed.